Hosted by Hermabiff1. What is the most disturbing thing you have seen in detail? A man ran across the highway on a late rainy night. I was the passenger of the second car that hit him. I clearly saw the man's face and what he was wearing. I also unfortunately saw the aftermath of what happened after he was thrown off our car farther into traffic. Seeing someone get sprayed off the highway by a fire truck is something I will never forget. There's a family in my community with a devastating story. One of the saddest stories of any family you'll hear in your life. Anytime we bring them up, someone says, "Please, I can't think about that." The parents were having a really messy divorce. All of their children had bad mental illnesses and drug problems. One son, however, who we'll call Joey for confidential reasons, was going to college for Division I baseball. He stayed away from drugs despite his friends who did them and tried his best in school. Joey was on vacation and dived headfirst off a boat. The water was more shallow than he thought and his head smashed into the ground, breaking the spine instantly. He was paralyzed from the neck down. This didn't kill Joey's spirits. He was still happy and kept a cheerful personality. His dad basically left while also taking everything from the mom. She was left to support the kids and Joey, being in a very bad financial situation. A few months later, his younger brother died of an overdose. The very same week, Joey was eating steak and started to choke. No one was around to notice, and when he was finally rescued, his brain was without oxygen for minutes. He became brain damaged. What's even more tragic is Joey was starting to regain mobility in his arms and got told he may be able to walk again. This happened years ago. I was coming back from work and intended to smoke a joint on the beach, close to my house. The beach is very windy and I didn't want to waste anything, so I just thought, yeah, I'm gonna roll it on the subway's toilet. There I was, on the cabine, toilet empty. Then comes a boy with a man. There was water all over the ground, so I could see what's happening from the reflection. They went together to the cabin on my left side. Then I hear the sound of a belt getting detached and the man pull his pants down. I panicked, already knew what was happening there. For a second I thought, I have drugs with me. If I report this and they suspect me as well, I'll get in trouble too. You know what? Fuck it. Kid's in danger, I can't think about myself now. Then I hit the cabin's wall with 2 punches and screamed, "Hey, what the fuck is happening there?" Kid started to cry. The man pulled his pants up, let his belt on the floor and ran away. I packed my stuff and ran after, screamed to the security, but the man was gone. We went to the CCTV room. I confirmed the man's appearance by the footage, while securities was trying to figure out who the boy was. Turns out the boy was kidnapped some stations before, and his mother was desperately looking for him. I even had to wait the police arrival, and explain all that stuff. I said I was taking a shit, glad they didn't search my bag or my ass. I haven't seen too much that bothered me, but I was a 911 dispatcher for many years and there are many things I've heard that I can't not think about. Woman called after finding husband hung himself in his shed. She is frantic and I hear a little voice in the background ask, "What's wrong with daddy?" I've heard more people than I can count die on the phone with me. A man robbed a pharmacy and I listened to the pharmacist die gargling on his own blood. I took a car accident and asked the caller to perform CPR and he said I can't, he doesn't have a face, so yeah. I can't type anymore cause my anxiety is rising. I am a human tissue and organ banker, meaning I take parts from the deceased to give to the living. One of my donors was a woman who accidentally drowned in her bathtub. While preparing her body to do the procedure, I noticed a big bruise in the shape of hand on the back of her neck, as if someone had been pushing her head down. I called the medical examiner. He initiated an investigation. Turns out the husband was good friends with the police in that area. He had been a cop at one point. They all tried to protect him and bury it. The husband ended up killing himself not long after. I have several stories like that, unfortunately. Another type of disturbing is a donor we had that was an infant that unfortunately didn't make it. We can take the heart valves to help another baby. I was having a hard time getting blood for serology testing, so I called my coordinator and asked if I could get the mother's blood because it's allowed to be used instead for newborns. I was informed that the mother was so upset about the baby that she crashed her car shortly after leaving the hospital and would be my next donor, so I could get her blood then. We do not know if she did it on purpose or not. I felt so bad for her poor husband. My first dead body experience that wasn't family dying of old age was when I was freshly 18 and had just gotten my CNA license. They drilled into us that we are required to help if we see someone in need of medical attention, even if we were barely trained to do much. I was driving back from Disney alone after a day with my family and I see a car accident on the side of the highway and a dude trying to wave anyone down to help. I stopped because I thought I had to. The dude ran with me to his buddy that was thrown from the vehicle at a stupid high speed and landed on his face and slid for what looked like 50 yards. I was a kid, no idea how far it was, but it was a lot of blood. His face was gone. There was nothing I could do but wait with the friend and stop him from trying to run into traffic. I was 5 years old in 1968. My family was on a road trip from California to visit relatives in Kansas. Somewhere on Route 66 in New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere, we came across a very awful accident scene. My mom and dad told me and my little brother to put our heads down and not look, but of course, I did. Saw 10 blue corpses and one person who was still horribly wounded but walking. No ambulance on site. Dad kept on driving. Later in life I became an EMT and now work in pathology. That moment of seeing death and suffering has affected me ever since. I used to be a firefighter/EMT. We were returning to the station after a medical call. Driving down the highway, a small plane crashed and burst into flames about 500 yards ahead of us. Obviously, we were first on scene. We were on the ambulance, so no firefighting capabilities. We got out and were walking around performing a size up for incoming crews. After everyone got there, I realized the debris on the road was actually burnt human body parts. I walked in that area for 10 minutes before we realized it. If I remember correctly, the plane had 7 passengers. All dead. Several kids. I helped pull the remainder of the bodies from the cockpit with the medical examiners. I got back to the station, took my boots off and saw flesh in the treads. I kept those boots for years and they would always trigger flashbacks whenever I saw them. Couldn't put them on ever again. But couldn't throw them away. My stomach is still in knots after writing this. It was almost 10 years ago. I'm a first responder and I've seen some really messed up things. One of which was a younger girl, 19-ish, who was in a car accident. She was partially ejected as the car rolled over. It landed squarely on her face and head. The top of her head had cracked open and her brains were all over the ditch. Her face had been smashed so badly it was almost inverted to the back of her head. Her teeth had come through where her nose was. After the call, I decided to try and find her social media to see her face in a normal state, in an attempt to change the way I saw her in my own memory. It didn't help. I saw she was a new mom to her 2-month-old son that she left at home to go out with friends. R.I.P. My GF's suicide. Had to ram myself into her room. What fell on me was her furniture she piled against the door. I got up, thinking I couldn't see for some reason her face. I was thinking, what did she do? 'Cause I saw a bottle of pills next to her. When I got closer, I screamed, her eyes faintly opened. She had shot herself. I jumped in the bed panicking, not realizing blood was spilling on me. Holding her, crying, talking to 911, I couldn't do CPR, regretted not trying. She went from warm and sweaty to stone cold in my arms. She had pulled the trigger prematurely, investigator on the case confirmed, so she shot herself like a little below the left side of her jaw to her neck. The blood, her insides. The sight of it all still haunts me along with my screams. Skipped a night class and drove around so my parents wouldn't know I skipped class. I saw a guy jaywalking and I slowed down and noticed the car behind me flying and he goes around me. The guy is about a hop away from stepping on the curb and he gets hit. I expected him to roll over the car or something like in the movies, but instead be bounced off and went about 20 feet in the air and lands head first on the center divider. I'll never forget that sound when he hit. Poor guy was waking back to his hotel after spending the day with his family at Disneyland. I was in a single-car triple fatal accident when I was 17. The driver was drunk. He and I were the only survivors. We had all told him to stop driving, but he wouldn't. He was speeding and I knew we were going to crash. I felt so trapped. When we did finally crash, the person in the passenger seat hit their head on the dash so hard it bludgeoned them. In the back seat, one of the doors was completely gone. My one friend was outside of the car underneath one of the tires. My door wouldn't open, so I had to crawl over his body with my working arm and my face, feeling the way his bones were all crumpled beneath me. Our other friend was missing. I didn't even realize he was missing until EMTs arrived and the numbers felt off to me. He was found 35 feet off in the blackberry bushes, broken from his ribs down and still moaning. He was airlifted to the same hospital I was and died after 10 hours of surgery. It was gnarly. EMT, 911 dispatcher here. Took a few calls that fucked me up a bit. Mothers doing CPR on their SIDS babies. A woman finding her brand new fiancé holding a gun to his head and hearing him blow open his head with her watching. responding to an infant that was ejected 50 feet in her car seat from the back seat of a vehicle that was hit head-on by a drunk driver at highway speeds. Her head was crushed. Her tiny fingers looked like a doll's hands, they were so white and cold. Standing in a CT room with a mother whose baby girl was found unconscious, we got pulses back, but knowing that everyone else in the room knew exactly that the CT showed she was brain dead but that the mother had no idea. Working on a young woman who jumped from a vehicle going highway speeds to get away from her, most likely, sex traffickers. She was found naked, alive, but covered in Sharpie writing that said "Help me. Help me." Written over and over and over again. She was never identified. Was brain dead and got pulled off life support a few days later. Taking a 911 call from a man trapped inside a home on fire, telling him to stay low to the ground and begging him to find a window, and listening to the silence take over after a few minutes of him begging me back for help. He was found burned to death due to the intensity of the fire. I was preparing dinner one night and my fiancée heard screaming outside our apartment. We looked out and saw 3 men dragging a girl into a car. I panicked and immediately called 911. Once the men got her into the car, which was parked at the top of the T intersection of my apartment complex, they just left the car and walked away. 10 minutes go by and an officer drives by the car twice, the same car I described, and does nothing. This car was parked in the middle of the road, not in a parking spot but very obvious. The minute the cop drives away, an SUV pulls up and 2 guys get out and drive off in both vehicles. To this day my blood boils thinking about that officer not checking the car and feeling guilty for not doing more. But I don't own a gun and what was I supposed to do with 3 to 4 guys and just me? Still makes me feel sad. Okay, so for some context, I used to work at a prison. I was a custodial lead for medical areas. Normally that meant that whatever I was cleaning up, i.e. bodily fluids, was there for a while. Like I wasn't normally involved in codes, I just cleaned up the bloody mess left behind. There was this one time however where I got to see a prison riot firsthand. Mind you, I wasn't down on the yard. I was a good 20 or so yards away behind a fence, but I saw the cops trying to break it up. They threw CS gas to try and stop the main offenders. When some of the inmates refused to stop fighting, the guards started shooting rubber pellets at them. When I was a kid I thought rubber pellets wouldn't hurt that bad, I used to think of them like bouncy balls. That is. Until I saw one of the inmates. They were wheeling him away strapped to a gurney right past me to the TTA. Triage and treatment area. I honestly thought I was looking at a dead man for a moment. His face. I'm not sure I could describe it. He was covered in blood, half his face looked as though it had been skinned off. The other half was so swollen that he didn't even look human anymore. If you'd asked me to point out where his eyes were under that mess, I'm not sure I could have told you. The image still haunts me sometimes. A homeless guy came into the ER and I had to go get a skull x-ray. Turns out he had bone cancer and it had metastaticized to his skull. He hadn't been getting any treatments for his cancer. I came into his room with my x-ray machine. The right side of his face from the bottom of the upper jaw to above where his right eye should have been was a massive gaping black hole. Just a deep dark empty hollow cavity where the right side of his face should have been. It caught me off guard and creeped me out for a second, but then I reeled it back in and composed myself. But then something caught my eye. Almost as if there was something moving. In that deep dark hole. I turned some more lights on and took a closer look. You guessed it. Maggots. Hundreds and hundreds of little white maggots crawling all over each other just munching away at the dead rotting tissue deep inside this man's face. It was so fucking metal, I didn't know whether to puke into his face hole or run away. But yeah, bullet wounds, stab wounds, degloved fingers, etc. etc. Of all the terrible shit I've seen or witnessed over the years working in medicine, that was easily the most disturbing. My brother was type 1 diabetic and my cat pissed him off somehow, so he filled one of his syringes with insulin and injected it into my cat. I found her laying on the floor acting weird and asked what was wrong with her. He told me. I told my mom. She wouldn't let me take the cat to the vet because my brother would have gotten in trouble. I should have grabbed her and carried her, it was less than 1 mile. But I was only 10, and I wasn't allowed to walk that far by myself. So instead, I held her and cried until she died. My sister, who was heavily pregnant at the time with her first baby, got hit by a smackhead driving too fast round a hairpin bend outside where I lived. Opened the front door to see her pinned against the wall. It was that hard it knocked the ceramic cistern lid off my toilet and all the stuff from my shelf was on the floor. This happened about 5 p.m. She got taken to casualty, they couldn't find the baby's heartbeat. Ended up delivering him stillborn, couldn't stop her internal bleeding, had to perform a hysterectomy, the dead baby was brought into us. Then the surgeon said my sister needed to go for more emergency surgery. A nurse came into the family room to tell us to go and wish her luck. I refused as I knew I'd see her later, but the nurse made me go. I think they knew. Last time I saw her alive, she was on a trolley getting rushed away. She looked terrified. I will never forget the look in her eyes. Couple of hours later I got to see her in the morgue. Few days later got to see her and her baby in the funeral parlor. I was warned they had both been bashed and the baby was covered in case I didn't see him. Still lifted up the sheet to see the nephew I'd never play with. All this, 3 months after my best mate hung himself. Sorry it's a bit long, haha. Context. When I was younger my father let my godfather stay with us. He was a great guy but had a lot of drug issues from his childhood. This was fine for me because I actually know right from wrong and I learned quite quickly that I shouldn't be doing anything or acting anything like him of his friends, so I kind of just talked to his friends and smoked a little bit of weed because I was allowed to in the garage, his room, and I met quite a few interesting people and heard a few interesting stories. Today will be an experience of mine. Story: was 14, getting a glass of water from the kitchen at 2 a.m. because I'm an insomniac, and to get to the kitchen you walk past the bathroom and turn right so in full view of the bathroom door. Was just sipping out my water cup when I hear this strange noise. My dog's sick at the moment. Is she wheezing or something? No, she's asleep. My brother has friends over. Are they smoking and just had a bad hit and are struggling? No, they're outside too far away. Then the thought occurs to check the bathroom because the door was kind of cracked open but the lights were out. Probably in hindsight not a good idea, but being 14 I needed to know, otherwise I'd be too curious to go to bed. Well, I found my godfather's friend Lou. Lou was a sweetheart, and we both had issues with self-harm at the stage and had bonded over our issues and confided in each other. We were genuinely close and good friends, as much as you can be with a crackhead twice your age, and talked every day and set goals of getting better with each other and set goals of extending our life expectancy. Weird, but I was a weird kid and she was a weird woman and we found comfort in each other. Well, much to the shock of little me, Lou was in my bathtub with her arms cut almost to bone from wrist to shoulder, the only unopened part of her skin at the elbow containing a needle hanging out of it. She was a junkie, and I knew she tried to kill herself by meth overdose, but it's harder than it seems, so she couldn't inject all of the meth before she started losing too much blood. I literally had no idea what to do, and couldn't fully process what I was seeing. The bathtub was filled with bloody water and she was lying with her head rolled to the side murmuring and moaning, and I tried to ask her questions and ask if she was fading out or anything, and I got a bit of a grunt for a response and it all kind of just sunk in. She was white as the bathtub, and I knew she didn't have much longer to go before she would have died, and to this day my whole family agrees that she would have died if I was not getting a glass of water that night. I left the bathroom and closed the door, then knocked on my dad's door and said, "Hey Dad, I think someone's in the bathroom not doing well." He didn't know what was happening, but I think he just had a bad feeling because he got up straight away and walked to the bathroom. He asked me who it was and I said, "I think it's Lou," and he looked at me with this sad look and told me not to come in the bathroom. I never had the heart to tell him I saw and talked to her. I didn't want him to think I'd be traumatized by the sight. These days I still don't think he knows I fully saw her, but my dad, my brother and I all think back to that night and it was truly one of the most terrifying things to have happened in our house. Not exactly an encounter, but I live on the outskirts of town, big, low-populated neighborhood/college campus. My very old first-grade teacher lives about 2 blocks up from me. One morning during the spring, I decided to take a different way to work because I woke up earlier than usual and was killing time. I drove past her when she was walking home from a nearby grocery store she shopped at. This time of year I was running a 2-mile route nightly around 9 p.m. that took me literally by her front door. She had an undeveloped road that was subject to future traffic which would become an alternate entrance to our neighborhood. That road was 20 feet from her front door and what I assume was her upstairs bedroom directly above it. That evening on my run, I seen a light on upstairs and thought it was odd seeing as how I run around 9 to 9:30 p.m. and it hadn't stood out before, but for the following month I had seen that light on and never thought anything about it. I run with headphones in and because she's 2 blocks from my house I have them full blast at that point and can't hear a thing. Turns out, she fell down in the early days of that month, and broke a hip and couldn't get back up, and was probably screaming for help and I could have never heard her. Due to where her house was situated no other house would hear her. There is 2 vacant lots on both sides. A house directly across from her house had a garage facing her, and the house behind her had at least 50 to 75 yards between them. Utilities were subsequently shut off and family was clearly not around to check on her. From the sounds of it, she melted into the house before someone found her. This was 3 to 4 years ago and nothing has been done with the house, so I don't even know if she had family at all. The only thing done with the property is no trespassing signs being posted. I was likely the last person to see her alive and the last person close enough to hear and potentially save her. About 20 years ago, a group of us girls were at a massive party in a warehouse that a local college was hosting. We are all drunk and the party was closing down, so we had called a cab. I went outside to have a smoke and wait. The other girls went to the bathroom. It's March and there's still snow. So I'm outside smoking and I hear a rustling, a wet sort of groan to my right. None of us have cell phones or flashlights. But the taxi pulled up and the headlights hit what had made the noise. A person who has been thoroughly beaten by a baseball bat. They left it, there was not much of his face that wasn't just bloody pulp. Taxi driver called 911. While I put him in recovery position and tried to slow some bleeding and keep him warm. We never found out who did it or why. But the guy survived with significant brain injuries. My husband and I were driving on a county highway we use often. Up ahead there were 3 or 4 cars stopped and a tractor trailer, 18-wheeler, half pulled over to the right side of the road in front of a house. The cars finally went around the truck into the left lane. When I got up there, I realized why they were stopped. In the road lay a German Shepherd. His eyes were open, and he was perfectly intact from his head down to just below his front legs. However, at that point, his body ended in a somewhat diagonal angle. The rest of his body, also intact, was about 30 feet down the road. Blood and little bits of body organs were scattered in between. The truck driver was in the driveway of the house talking with a man and woman, who I presume were the dog's owners. The truck must have hit him going at 60 miles per hour and just split him in two. It was the most gruesome thing I had ever seen. I was in New York, living in New York on September 11th. I saw people jumping out of the building, I saw the towers fall, I saw people walking up the street covered in white dust completely devastated. That night people are on the streets nervous and suddenly 100 people come running down 34th Street because they said there was a bomb in the Empire State Building. I literally left my drink in my bag and ran down the street, almost ran back for my cats in my apartment. Every day I walked to work and past the armory where the pictures of all the people who were missing just posted there. I kept looking, I knew I had to know somebody. And then I saw her. My coworker's beloved wife. He talked about her all the time. I felt like I knew her. I went to her funeral and he and his 2 young children sang this off-tune song that was so poignant somehow, and then later he gave a eulogy that included the words "with still think she'll be pulled out safe in the rubble." The whole year was not only horrible, it was creepy. In fact, 20 years, it took 20 years to feel like it was okay not to cry on 911. I know this isn't a creepy story, but for me it's an everyday nightmare. Not me, but my mother said that when she was 9 and living in El Salvador with her 4 other sisters, the youngest being 4 and the oldest being 11, they had gone out to the street to take pictures to send to their mom who was in the US at the time. She said that while taking pictures they saw the cars on the street merging to one lane and there was a man on the ground who had taken a machete to the face. She said he had a white shirt and jeans on and his belt was in his hand, which he used to try to defend himself. She said his face was slashed vertically twice and he had 1 slash on his throat with open wounds and blood everywhere. Said she has never forgotten seeing that, and when she saw it she just stood there staring, fear, sadness, and all other emotions coming to her at once while her older sister tried to cover the youngest sister's eyes. Years ago I lived in a fabulous apartment on Bridgefoot Street in Dublin. This is where anything nice pretty much ends in this story, overlooking an abandoned warehouse across the street that was sometimes snuck into by homeless people/junkies. Occasionally they'd light a fire in a barrel and sit/stand around drinking, etc. This was all like whatever, fine, we could see it from our windows. One night we had friends over, having a few cocktails and sitting on the windowsill chatting to a couple of friends when we spot a bunch of clearly grown men taking a girl who looked no more than say 11 if a day in through a panel on the gate. Obviously, no matter what, this was not an appropriate place for a child, and while they were, as it looked to us, chatting to her in the yard of the place, everyone basically was like, okay, we need the police here. I vividly remember how one of the men kept stroking her hair, another man leaning down to talk to her, and she looked so small and slight, wearing pink pajamas and she had a coat on, but honestly it didn't even look like it was correct for the weather because it was a fairly warm evening. It clearly didn't belong to her, and we all sort of couldn't really believe the level of emergency that this entire scenario was screaming at our eyes. It was a strange feeling, like knowing that if we didn't do something there was no way this was ever going to end innocently. I remember one of the guys saying maybe one of them is her dad? I don't know, what do we do? And my best friend, a psychologist, just putting her drink down and asking, so your junkie dad brought you to warehouses full of men cracked out of their minds on meth in your fluffy PJs regularly? Did he? Obviously, we called the cops super fast. They rocked up, called in to us and radioed back that they had a clear view from our living room of the whole warehouse complex, etc. We never did hear back from the cops again, but they did take the girl away separately and arrested a bunch of people. The female guarda looked relieved we'd called, and I remember thinking she seemed a bit shaken. I mean, we were shaken. It was a bizarre situation. Warehouse mysteriously burned down about a week later. I don't want to know, but I hope that was the first time that kid had been there, but I'm just glad we noticed it that night. Genuinely wouldn't have been able to sleep if we hadn't called. There is no situation in which that child should have ever been there.